We're moving on to our next session, which is brought to you by Etihad Airways. Now, the topic of discussion will be growing global executives, the new competencies. What are these competencies? Well, to tell you about it, our next speaker will be Ms. Ripa Rashid, the Executive Vice President of the Center for Talent Innovation and Managing Partner of Hewlett Consulting Partners, New York. Ms. Rashid has worked across Europe, the Americas, and Asia Pacific. She is the co-author of Growing Global Executives, the Core Competencies, Winning the War for Talent in Emerging Markets, Why Women Are Solution, The Battle for Female Talent in Emerging Markets, and a series of BRIC country reports and Asians in America. Unleashing the Potential of the Model Minority. Ms. Rashid is an internationally recognized subject matter expert on gender, global leadership, and next-generation talent strategies. I think that should be of particular interest, next generation. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Rashid.
Good morning, everyone. Is the mic working? Yeah, I have a loud voice, but not loud enough for this room without a mic. So how's everyone doing today? Good? Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm going to be talking to you today about a book that is very close to my heart. Yeah? Being Global Executive. How many people here have worked outside of their country of origin? Raise your hands. Great. So I see about maybe 25, 30%. How many of you work for a multinational company? That covers all the rest of you. This book is for all of you. Yeah? I started my career over 20 years ago as a young Bangladeshi girl working for an American company sent to Mexico. Nobody gave me a guide. Nobody told me how to manage the complexities of working in a global multinational environment and building credibility, building trust, and creating value in multiple complicated dimensions. That's what this book is about. What we wanted to do in this book is get beyond very simple cross-cultural leadership, simple paradigms of how you behave in China as a business person or in the Middle East or in Latin America. We wanted a much more complicated model. And that's what I'm going to share with you today in the next 45 minutes. I'm going to skip through that. This book was published in October 2015, so it's hot off the presses. It was co-authored with Dr. Sylvia Ann Hewlett, who is one of the world's renowned leadership experts. She's been recognized as one of the top thinkers in the world, and I've had the privilege of partnering and working with her for almost a decade now. This is our 7th collaboration, and this book really kind of has hit a nerve. When we first published it, we thought, we have so much data. The data was this. We did one of the largest surveys of global executives around the world. We surveyed 18,000 people in 11 countries. Yeah? And this range of countries went from developed markets, the US, UK, Japan, to the BRIC countries, so the largest developing markets, to middle-income countries and other hubs such as South Africa, Turkey, Hong Kong, and Singapore. We really wanted the full expanse of development because we knew that large multinationals, such as those that had sponsored this work, operated in those entire range of economies. And we wanted to find out what it meant to be a global executive across those economies, what the differences were, what were the universals, and what we could learn. And why did we do this? We knew that over the last 30 years, globalization has accelerated like never before. You heard from the previous speaker, Mr. Sanjeev Mehta, the term Vuca, right? Did everyone know this term? I was going to use the term, but I'm not going to say it again since he already took it from me. But we wanted to capture the Vuca world. But what we do know is the world is going to get more and more Vuca. And you know why? Because we know the center of growth economically in the globe has shifted. It has been shifting dramatically in the last 2 decades, and it'll continue to shift in the next 3 decades. Macroeconomic projections estimate that in the next 3 decades, 2/3 of global GDP growth is going to come from emerging markets, from countries like Bangladesh, from countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, from the BRIC countries. Only 1/3 of global growth is going to come from what we think of as the traditionally developed economies. So we wanted to create a framework where we understood what it takes to be successful as a professional across all of those boundaries. What we also knew was that the Vuca world for large companies like the ones you work for involved 2 big types of changes. First, companies based in Western countries, so in the US, UK, and the mature markets, generate more and more of their revenues outside of their home markets. For instance, of the S&P 500, the top 500 companies in the US, publicly listed, they generate more than 50% of their revenues outside of the US. That number is only going to go up. On the other hand, large multinational companies which are headquartered in developed countries, think Infosys, think Tata, yeah? Think of Etihad, for instance. These companies are going increasingly global. They manage more and more of their staff around the world. So this increasing globalization is the reality of the world we all live in. It's new for those of us who are a little bit older, but for those who are young, anyone who's below 30 in this room, this is the new norm. This is reality. So we wanted to create a portrait of what it's like to succeed in that new normality. We also knew that something else was going on. 25 years ago, a large multinational, take a Unilever or a Procter & Gamble, when they started an operation in an international location, they had a typical model. They typically sent someone from the home country. Yeah? So if I'm P&G, I send an American to the Philippines. If I'm Unilever, I send a Brit or a Dutch person to Brazil. That was the model. Even until 2008, 56% of senior leadership roles in emerging markets were held by expats. Then something happened. Something big happened in 2008. Remember? Does anybody remember 2008? Big global crash, yeah? Prompted by the mortgage crisis in the US. But as a result of that crash, what happened? Funding dried up, money dried up, so the expat model, which had become very expensive, was unsustainable. So companies had to build local talent. The numbers you see here show that between 2008 and 2010, there was a shrinkage in the number of expats, yeah, from 56% to 12%. Sorry, from 1998, in 10 years, 56% to 12%. So what was going on? It wasn't just the fact that it was more expensive to sustain the expat model. The expat model also didn't work because expat models assumed that best practices came from mature markets and were exported to developing markets. In this VUCA world, where does innovation happen? Everywhere. Where does creativity happen? Everywhere. It's not just focused in developed markets. So we really wanted to understand what is going on with all these creative, talented individuals all over the world who are far away from headquarters. Yeah? What is going on and what does it take for them to succeed to their full potential? I wanted to find out through this research what it took for an individual to succeed to their full ambition no matter where they were from and where they were located. So that is the mission of what we're trying to do. And so luckily, we had access to this amazing research. As I said, 18,000 data points. We also interviewed hundreds of executives, people like yourselves, in focus groups. We interviewed CEOs. And so after 3 years, we put together what I think of as a very holistic model of what it takes to be a global executive. What we found is that there are 3 universal things that a person needs to do to succeed on the global stage. And those are the 3 things I'm going to share with you. I'm going to share with you some of the data we found, as well as some of the stories that we heard, because stories are the things that stay in our minds and illuminate the data the most. The 3 things we found that you need to do to succeed as a global executive, the 3 things I wish someone had told me 23 years ago when I was in Mexico, was you need to do these 3 things. 1, you need to project credibility globally across multiple dimensions. And we'll go into what this means, but the main concept that I'm going to share with you here is really how do you inspire trust and confidence among your stakeholders. The second piece is driving value locally. This really means inspiring your teams, creating the environments, such as actually what Mr. Mehta talked about earlier, where people are excited to go to work and contribute to their fullest. That's how creativity happens, and that's how innovation happens. And we discovered specific attributes of the types of leadership skills you need to master to create those environments. And the third pillar, and in some ways this is the most critical, is to gain sponsorship. And I'll go into this concept a little bit in a few minutes. So let's get started. Projecting credibility. Projecting credibility links to a piece of work that we've been working on at my think tank, the Center for Talent Innovation, called executive presence. How many of you have heard this term, executive presence? I see some names, great, some hands up, thank you. So executive presence is a concept which translates into this. Executive presence is that which conveys, that telegraphs your leadership potential. When you meet someone, have worked with them for a while, and you know that they have all the tangibles of leadership, meaning credentials, background, expertise, people skills. Executive presence is the stuff that goes on top of that. It's the intangible aspects of leadership. And when we've done work on executive presence for this book, leaders tell us that it is 26% of what they look at when they interview someone and hire them, or when they select someone for a senior role. Executive presence is what it takes to be leaderly. Executive presence, we also found, is a really interesting concept because it's often been a black box. People say, oh, he has it, she doesn't have it. What is this it? And we really wanted to know, and we did, again, research. I work for an economist, Dr. Hewlett. I myself have a background as an astrophysicist as well as an anthropologist. So I like data, and I like to look at cultures and systems. So that's where all of this is coming out of. And we found that executive presence consists of 3 main things. The biggest part of it is gravitas, which is how you behave. The second part of it is communication, the bubble in the bottom that you see here. And that is how you speak, how you influence, how you impact people. And the third piece, and a very small piece, less than 10%, is appearance. It's looking professional, it's looking as if you respect the people around you. Yeah? Executive presence varies widely between cultures. Yeah? It varies widely between companies. So a bank, for instance, like a Goldman Sachs, has a very different definition of executive presence than a much more relaxed environment like a startup or a technology company like a Google or a Facebook. Think pinstripe suits, that's executive presence at Goldman Sachs, versus hoodies and sandals at Facebook or Google. So very different. What we wanted to dive into when it comes to the global domain, because we really wanted to see how does this play out. Originally, we did this research in the US only. And we wanted to build on that and find out, well, how does it look when we go to all these 11 countries that I mentioned? And what we found was exactly the same dimensions apply. In some ways, executive presence, the components of executive presence, gravitas, communication, appearance, how you behave, how you speak, and how you appear, how you show up, are universals. These are the three components of what it takes to convey and project credibility. And we did a deep dive into this. In the global domain, we found that the 6 behaviors that lend credibility to someone, that make someone have executive presence, have that it factor that you want to hire them, you want them on your team, you want to work with them, you want to give them that special project, are these 6 behaviors. The first one is demonstrating integrity. This was a really interesting one. Of our 18,000 sample, 71%, so that was our largest number, said that integrity was the most important part of conveying credibility. And that was a really interesting one because that was not on the top of the list in our US data. And we kind of went back and did a lot of conversations in focus group and said, why is this? Why is integrity at the top of the list for a global executive? Any guesses? Any? All right, we'll have some more conversation in the Q&A. But the reason integrity, it turned out, was so important in the global domain was because what you really need to do to gain credibility is to gain trust. And you can only trust someone if they have integrity. So in environments where the corporate governance rules are unknown, there may be issues with, different systems, translation across systems, integrity becomes critical. Some of the other things on this list might be obvious. Inspiring a following, that's important for a leader, whether you're a global leader or a local leader, it doesn't matter. But it's still an important one, and it's near the top of the list. Projecting authority was another really interesting one. But what we found when we went below the details was how you projected authority varied widely from country to country. In some countries, you needed to project authority in a very assertive way, and that was most often in Western countries. Think of a leader like Jack Welch. I call him the fist thumper. That's how he projected authority. In other countries, you need to project authority in a much more reserved way. Yeah? Many Asian cultures prefer more reserved ways of projecting authority. The other piece I want to mention here is number 5 on the list, which is conveying EQ, emotional intelligence. When we went back and did interviews with senior leaders across the world about this dimension, we showed them this list and said, what do you think of it? Does this resonate? What does it mean to you? How has this applied to you? One of the comments that came across many of our senior leaders was that emotional intelligence they were surprised in some ways to see it there, but then they weren't surprised. They said, had you done this research 20 years ago, we don't think emotional intelligence would have even showed up. Yeah? 20 years later, when you are working across multiple dimensions, multiple cultures, and nothing is known and predictable in our Vuca world, you need to apply emotional intelligence much more effectively. So again, emotional intelligence had multiple dimensions of how you express it. And there are also gender dimensions to it. How women express it, we found, was very different than how male leaders expressed it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But before that, I want to share with you about another interesting aspect of projecting credibility that we found. We found that, while these 6 aspects of projecting credibility, of gaining trust across stakeholders, were universal, the emphasis on this was different no matter where you went. And we actually found a fascinating pattern. We found that in the developed markets, where a lot of companies are headquarters, most of the companies that we were working with here were headquartered in the US or UK. Projecting authority was much higher in the rank order, as you'll see here, on the left-hand side of the slide, much higher ranked than in what we call the local growth markets, where it really was lower in the top 6. On the other hand, emotional intelligence was much lower in developed markets and much higher in the local markets. Puzzling this was for us, you know? There were universals, but the priorities were very different, and it seemed to be that being emotionally intelligent, after demonstrating integrity and inspiring a following, was really, really important. So we kind of went, again, through our interviews to find out, what does this really mean? And this is what we found. We found that actually that crisscross that you just saw, that crisscross between developed markets and developing markets, required a nimble, successful global executive to be very adaptable, to be very flexible, to be able to change their register. And we found that in our interviews, successful leaders were doing two things really, really well. They were projecting credibility through all those ways vertically towards headquarters. Yeah? This is what we call the vertical pivot. This is how you gain the trust of leaders at your company, often in a developed nation. You have to inspire trust by focusing on having authority, that they can trust you, by having integrity, by being able to lead across differences. We also found that the global executive needs to manage what we call the horizontal pivot. This horizontal pivot involves gaining credibility and trust across multiple stakeholders, your teams, your clients, the regulatory authorities in the countries you're working in, across multiple locations. In some ways, whether you work internationally or not, every executive manages this two-way pivot. You manage up in a certain way, and you manage sideways and down in a different way. Everyone does it. But what we found is that for a global executive, this is a whole lot more complicated, and you have to be much more attuned to the nuances and priorities that really make you effective, depending on where you are. We also, you know, being kind of coming from an economic point of view, we wanted to quantify the impact of that. We already quantified these were the top 6 behaviors. We also wanted to understand what the impact of it. You know, how do we know that these are good behaviors? How do we know that they create good environments for people to work in? And what we found was that for global executives who manage the horizontal pivot well, this is managing stakeholders in multiple locations effectively by projecting credibility in a very different way than you do vertically, you actually are more likely to be satisfied with your rate of progression. You see a 21% differential there. That's a good thing, right? Who doesn't want to be more satisfied with their rate of advancement? The second piece is the vertical. We found that that has a payoff as well. If you manage that well, you're actually 15% more likely to be satisfied. So taken together, there's a real payoff from managing the two-way pivot really, really well. Just to show you how complicated this is, just a quick, show of how these dimensions of the top 6 behaviors that inspire credibility vary across some of our sampled countries. And I've taken here, 3 of the BRIC countries, and you see, again, integrity kind of on the top, near the top, but then how authority is viewed in a very different way. So in China is the one I'll just point you towards. Really interesting to see that authority in an environment where communism and authoritarianism prevailed for decades, authority actually is much lower in the ranking of what it takes to be effective. It's much more important to have integrity, to inspire following, and have emotional intelligence. We also found some fascinating gender nuances. Remember, I mentioned to you earlier that in terms of authority, there are different ways you can project authority, and these vary widely from culture to culture. We also found these vary widely by gender. I've done a lot of work in the realm of women's leadership, so this was of particular interest to me. And what we found was that while it's much more acceptable for men to be conveying credibility conveying authority in an assertive way, for women, it's much more desirable in a female leader to be conveying your authority in a more reserved way. You see that pattern in these bars no matter what country you look at, with China being the place where it's most double standard. So we're not saying this is good or bad, we're just saying this is the reality. And so to be successful, the more information you have, the better. Facts are our friends, so these facts are intended to help us all navigate. So we found similar differences in terms of projecting emotional intelligence. We found, again, that there are two polarities in how you project emotional intelligence. One is by being attuned to other people's emotions. People around the room in a meeting, people on a conference call, people in a room like this. The other end of the spectrum is really being attuned to who you are. You know, how am I feeling? Do I want to come across as strong? Do I want to come across as open? Do I want to come across as informal or formal? All of those things go into how you project emotional intelligence. And what we find is that, again, there's a gender difference here. Not as stark as the one for authority, but we find the gender difference here as women are much more sought after as leaders if they are emotionally intelligent by being in touch with everybody else, by being able to feel the room. Whereas for men, they show leaderly behavior by being in touch with themselves, emotionally connected, strong, weak, what have you. So the double standard in terms of what is seen as desirable for a leader is alive and well. Not a good thing. I hope if I do this study in 20 years, those gaps will have narrowed a little bit and a wider range of behaviors around authority and emotions will be desirable and acceptable and effective for everybody, regardless of gender. So before moving on to the, to the second pillar, which is creating value, I'm just going to tell you a quick story about Makiko Eda. Makiko Eda is the head of Intel's marketing group in Japan, and she has a big sales function regionally as well. She's one of their senior-most women in Japan, and she, was hired as a junior employee in Intel and rose through the ranks and then was given a more senior role. And as she rose through the ranks, she had to go to the headquarters of Intel, which is in Santa Clara, California. And she realized that when she got to Santa Clara, the way she had been successful in Japan, which is by being deferential, by listening, by leading in a very reserved way, none of that was going to work in California. Yeah? She tells a story that the first few times she went, she felt completely lost. She would sit at meetings, no one would even look at her, no one would hear her, no one would ask her to speak. So she said, by the third time, she thought, this is a waste of time if I go and behave the same way in Santa Clara. I need to go there, make decisions, influence people, have people hear me, give me advice. I need to make it work. So she tells a story, she calls it, she said, when I realized that the next time I had to go to Santa Clara, I had to put on my iron panties. She said she had to be tough. I had to put on a cowboy hat and iron panties and be tough. And she made an effort to speak up, and if people didn't hear the small Japanese woman, she spoke again. And she had to be more assertive. She was managing that vertical pivot. Yeah, and she learned to do that. She wasn't comfortable with it in the beginning, but she really learned to manage that assertiveness, which required her to be outspoken, ask questions, and make herself heard. she also had to learn how to ask questions in a way that she was thought taken credibly. Then she'd go back to Asia and had a totally different set of things, because by then she was not only managing Japan, she was also managing Korea, Taiwan, and India. And she said when she started to travel to these countries, she said, this was Asia, but it wasn't my Asia. We all know how different Japan is, right, from this part of Asia. She experienced the reverse, and she had to start to manage what we call the horizontal pivot. And she said over the years, you know, she's constantly learned to shift her register and be this adaptive leader. And she's a master of what we call the two-way pivot. So if there's one thing you remember from today, please do remember the vertical pivot, which she managed with headquarters in California, where she really had to, you know, still be herself, but operate in that environment in a different way to be effective. And then she had to manage this horizontal pivot, which is multiple stakeholders, multiple countries, and really being attuned to the way she was assertive, to the way she actually projected her credibility across multiple dimensions. So now let's go to the second pillar of what it takes to be a successful global executive. In some ways, this pillar is the part that I've spent a lot of my recent work on, because this pertains to something that we called inclusive leadership. What we found in some of our original research into leadership in the US is that to drive innovation, and I heard innovation in the last talk, I know you're going to be hearing a lot about innovation through this organization, but to drive innovation, leadership, as usual, doesn't work anymore. Old school command and control leadership does not work anymore. Yeah? How did old school leadership work? Guy at the top, usually it was a guy, yeah, knew everything that they had to do. He separated it out into chunks and gave it to his deputies, who then separated it down, and everyone told, it was like a military model. It was command and control. So you set down the directives, people did things, and that's how work and value got created. Does this work in today's world? No, not in our connected world, because you know what? The guy at the top is great, but he doesn't know everything, because we live in a Vuca world. We live in a world where there's so much knowledge, one single person can't possibly know how to do things right for a large organization. So what we wanted to study is, instead of command and control, what is the new form of leadership? And we studied this in the US, and then we expanded this in this book to find out what it takes to succeed across these 11 countries. And again, we found that there were 6 universal behaviors that we call inclusive leadership. And these were the behaviors that we can quantify, I'll show you numbers in a second, create value, create the kinds of team environments where people feel like they can speak up and contribute their maximum and flourish. And these behaviors are as follows. First, asking questions and listening carefully. This is actually the #1 piece of the inclusive leader model. And it's different from what we found just for the US. It was particularly important when you work globally, because there are so many more unknowns. You cannot assume you know the rules of the game. So how do you find out? By asking and listening to your peers, to people who work for you, to your clients. The second piece is giving feedback. This is a really interesting one, because this is a hard one to do, but the only way people grow is feedback. You know, I was once told by someone who gave me feedback that actually made me cry, that feedback is a gift. Yeah? And I've realized that over the course of my career. Feedback is a gift, and it's the only way you grow. So that's a big part of it. Facilitating constructive argument. Diametric opposite to command and control. You need to have teams where people say, hey, that sounds good, but maybe if we did it a little differently, it would be even better. You need to be listening to those voices that dare to say, maybe that's not right, or dare to say flat out no. Fourth item is taking and implementing advice from those on the ground. Again, you don't always know the answers. You know, I've lived and worked in 14 countries, and you know, I'll tell you, when I first went to do work in Hong Kong, I had no idea. The only way I could learn, you know, I was working as a management consultant for a banking client. The only way I could learn was to ask questions and listen carefully and ask the right questions until I got the answers. And even then, continue to question. The next two pieces are kind of basic good leadership, but they're really critical when you're working globally, and I'll tell you why. The first one, maintaining regular contact with team members. The reality of today's workplace is that, you know, some people go into the office where you see your colleagues every single day. But more and more workplaces are becoming the kind of workplace that Sanjeev Mehta described, where people work from everywhere. You can work from home, you can be working in another country. You have teams that are run, you know, some of the companies we work with, American Express, Sodexo, they have people managing teams across 15 countries. So you have to figure out how to create an ethos of creativity across differences and virtually. So maintaining contact regularly and making sure you connect with people in an authentic way becomes really critical. I'll tell you a quick story. One of the leaders we interviewed, Andre Williams, is a senior leader based out of London for American Express, and he manages team. He's one of those guys who manages a 13-country team. And you know, he said in the beginning, you know, I didn't know what I was going to do. Do I have to go to every single one of these countries to get to know everyone personally? How on earth was I going to do that, you know, in a short period of time? But I wanted to build an environment where people knew me and felt comfortable, could do all of these things. And he said, you know, I knew I'd eventually get to Australia, and I'd eventually get to Singapore, and I'd eventually get to Shanghai. But in lieu of that, what I started to do in the beginning of all of our conference calls was I would, you know, speak of something personal, about something I did on the weekend, or ask people something personal. If I knew there was a rugby game going on in Australia, I'd ask people about it. So, you know, people often think on conference calls there's not time for chit-chat. He actually mastered the art of that and made sure he got to know his people individually. And he created a real art to managing these virtual relationships and maintaining contact and connectivity in a very deliberate way that still seemed authentic. And the final piece of this, I think, is kind of probably really, really critical, particularly for global teams, is sharing credit for team success. Again, just like no one leader knows everything and has the answers for everything, no one leader creates everything. So distributing credit is a critical part of the inclusive leader toolkit. So why be an inclusive leader? I mean, this sounds like all good leadership stuff, but you know, it's hard to do. It's hard to do all of this stuff. Facilitate argument. It's much easier to just tell people what to do, right? You know, why bother? Because there are real gains, and we actually quantified it. There are gains in two dimensions. One dimension is in that of team dynamics, yeah? What you find in the light bars here are teams who do not have an inclusive leader, yeah? These leaders do not have any of the 6 behaviors that we just talked about, yeah? Active listening, sharing credit for success, etc. The dark bars are teams with leaders who show at least 3 of those traits. Yeah? They're giving feedback, they're maintaining contact, etc. And what you see is almost a 3 to 4-fold increase in 3 critical team dynamics that create value and innovation and creativity. The first is you embrace the input of team members who are not like ourselves. So it might be a team where there's only one woman, or it might be a team where there's only one millennial or young person. It might be a team where there's only one foreigner. But making sure that that person's voice is heard and not drowned out. The probability of that increases 4-fold if you have an inclusive leader. Second, you create an environment where people feel safe to experiment and be creative and push the boundaries and do things outside of the normal. That's that data point in the middle, which says we are not afraid to fail. If you have an inclusive leader, there's a 3 times higher likelihood that teams are going to feel more comfortable with experimenting. And we know that being innovative requires taking risks. And finally, and this I think is one of the most important dimensions of a creative, innovative team, because again, creativity and innovation are the hallmarks of future success. No team is going to succeed in any global business without creativity. Is that nobody's afraid to challenge the status quo. If, you know, the most important person in the room says something and it doesn't really sit with you, you don't necessarily have to contradict them. But it's okay to say, hey, that's interesting, but should we really be thinking about it that way? So those are the 3 team dynamics that happen if you have an inclusive leader on a team. And, you know, who doesn't want to work in a team which is like this? You know, when I worked in Asia a year and a half ago, across Southeast Asia, and I talked to a lot of young people who said they preferred to work for multinational organizations because they found leaders who created this kind of environment where it was safe to speak, where they weren't afraid to take risks, and where they really, really felt like they were heard. That's what people want to do. They want to contribute and they want to be heard, and that's what drives engagement. They said, you know, we don't necessarily want to work for the old school environments where people tell us something to do and come back 3 weeks later and check in if we've picked it up. We want to be part of collaborative teams where we're creating things. We also found that at an individual level, inclusive leaders have a profound impact. First, you see again, the light bars are teams, individuals who do not work for an inclusive leader. And the dark bars are individuals who do work for an inclusive leader. So if you have an inclusive leader, you're 4-fold as likely to feel free to express your ideas. Who doesn't want to work for an environment where you can freely express your ideas? And then you're, again, hugely more likely to feel that your ideas are heard and recognized. And, you know, as anybody here who works in an environment that requires creativity, you need ideas from everyone at the table to solve problems. None of the problems most modern organizations solve are simple. They're complicated. You need as many good ideas around the table as you can to solve those problems. So these inclusive leadership behaviors are critical to driving creativity, value, and innovation, which are central to success in the decades ahead. So again, I'll tell you a little story now, and this is from my friend Sunil Nayak, who is the CEO of Sodexo, the services company in India. And Sunil is a fantastic guy. He developed his entire career in India and started to work for Sodexo, which is a French headquartered company. And he has 2 roles. He's heading up their global transformation, where they're going from a regionally structured company to a service line structured company. He also now runs actually all of South of Asia for Sodexo. But I'll tell a quick story about what Sanjeev said, that, you know, when he took over one of the countries in Southeast Asia, when he was managing, he went to visit the site, and he called a meeting of the top leaders there to get to meet them. And, you know, in the morning, he went around the table to get to introduce themselves. And, you know, he got the usual introduction. You know, name, rank, serial number. You know, I'm so-and-so, I've worked here for 5 years, and this is what I do. And Sanjeev was like, this, you know, Sunil was like, this isn't working for me. Let's step back. And he actually told a personal story about how difficult it had been for him in the beginning when he moved from kind of working for a different Indian company to this multinational environment in Sodexo. And he told a very personal story about his challenges. And then he said, let's start again. I want to hear stories like that from all of you. And so it made it a much more authentic connection, and it made him an inclusive leader. And he said after that meeting, the guy who'd headed up the country came up to him and said, Sunil, I've worked with these people for 10 years. I found out more about them in that 1-hour meeting than I had in 10 years. Thank you. You've really shown me how to lead in a different way. And one of the things Sunil says is that command and control has no place in his leadership toolkit. It's all about listening, it's all about engaging, it's all about understanding how decisions are made, and how you can get the best voices and ideas on the table. So now I'm going to move to my third final pillar. So, if you've mastered the first piece, projecting credibility, how you gain the trust of people at headquarters, the trust of people in your territory, so managing the two-way pivot, then create value by being an inclusive leader. The third thing you need to do to really catapult your career is to win sponsorship. How many people in this room are familiar with the term sponsorship, sponsor? Okay, not very many. I saw a few small hands go up. A few, okay, great. So I'm gonna, for the audience, just share. Many of you, I'm sure, and how many have heard the term mentorship? All the hands are gonna go up, I hope, right? Okay. So mentoring is a well-known concept. It's, it actually comes from the ancient Greek. It's from Odysseus. When he went on his journey, he left his son in the care of someone called mentor. So a mentor is someone who takes care of you, who guides you, who helps you navigate an environment. Yeah, that's what a mentor does, and mentors are really useful. But what we found in our research is for people to be really successful, they need mentors, but what they really need most is a sponsor. And a sponsor is, if you will, a turbocharged, really active mentor. A sponsor, we found, does a minimum of 3 things, and I'll show you what we find these 3 things are in the global domain. This work comes from a book authored by Sylvia and Hewlett called Forget a Mentor. That's in brackets, so it's not fully serious. You still need mentors. Find a sponsor. What a sponsor does for you is much more active than what a mentor does. Firstly, they get to know you and they believe in you. They really invest in you. They say, hey, that person is a superstar. They work really hard. I think they have a future here. They're going to be a leader. They believe in you. Secondly, they advocate for you. Yeah? This means that they are typically someone a little bit more senior to you, 1 or 2 levels above. So they're at circles of decision making that you can't be at, and they can be there and say, hey, that person Marina or that person Jeremy is really, really great. They should be considered for this role. They should be considered for this stretch assignment. They should be considered for this committee. Yeah, they advocate not just for your promotion. They will do that. They can do that eventually, but they advocate for your professional growth. And thirdly, they support your authority. This is really important in the global domain. If you have a sponsor in regional headquarters or main headquarters who supports your authority, people around you know that, hey, that person supports me and trusts me and gives me the wind behind my sails. Yeah? They empower you to make decisions. So at minimum, what a sponsor does are these 3 things: invest in you, advocate for you, and provide you with, supports your authority and empowers you. Yeah? Much more active than a mentor. In addition, they do at least 2 of the other things that you see on the list here. In return, the person that they are sponsoring, we call them the protege, has to do things too. They have to earn it. Sponsorship is profoundly different than mentoring in that it's a 2-way street. Anyone can ask for a mentor. Sponsorship needs to be earned, and it's merit-based. It's not based on familiarity. Traditionally, it has been, but what we're advocating for is inclusive sponsorship, where you should sponsor people like yourselves, but also very different for yourself. That's how you get more diversity and inclusion in leadership. So a global sponsor is someone who does these things. And why is a global sponsor so critical? Because we know from our data, we know that people who have a sponsor are much more likely to get 3 things that are critical to a successful global executive. They're much more likely to get a promotion, an international assignment, or a rotation at headquarters. These were the top 3 things that our global executives wanted out of their roles. And look at the light bars, those are people who do not have sponsors, and look at the dark bars. You have a significantly higher probability of gaining a promotion, a rotation at headquarters, or an international assignment if you have a sponsor. makes sense. You have someone who's backing you up. Yeah? So a sponsor is critical, is the third, final, most critical piece to gaining success as a global executive. The other interesting thing we found, so we knew sponsorship was going to be important for the journey of the global executive. We kind of knew that. But what we wanted to figure out was what are the dimensions of this, and we found that in terms of these three figures I showed you. But we also found that it was much more instrumental to have a sponsor at the center of power. So what you see here is, multinational employees who are satisfied with their rate of advancement. You see the numbers for those without a sponsor, 61%. They're still pretty satisfied, so that's good, right? But with a sponsor locally, so you have a sponsor in your local office, someone who's advocating for you, looking out for you, helping you flourish, it goes up a little bit to 68%. You're that much more likely to be happy. But with a sponsor at headquarters, look at that lift that happens. 83% are more likely to be happy with their rate of advancement. So huge uplift that comes from having, and headquarters might mean a regional headquarter. The closer your sponsor is to where decisions are made, where things can happen, the more you yourself can contribute, add value, and become visible to those realms. So in closing, I'm going to just share, a lot of the questions I get after I present a sponsorship is, oh, how do I get it? How do I get a sponsor? So we have a brief roadmap here for a protege. So if you're an ambitious, young executive, these are the things you need to do. And we've documented this again, based on data, based on interviews, based on research. Again, I wish someone had given this to me 23 years ago as well. First, we encourage you to have clarity around where you want to go. It says here, create a 5-year plan. It could be a 2-year plan, it could be a 3-year plan, it could be a 10-year plan, but have a plan. Have a real vision of where you want to go and what you aspire to. Then you actually should scan the horizon for potential sponsors. Some of your sponsors could be mentors who become sponsors. So the existing network you have, your sponsor could be your boss, or your sponsor could be a boss from a previous job who really believed in you. Last night I was presenting at the Women in Leadership chapter for the Brand Forum, and we heard some great stories of people who had been sponsored into very important roles, who, they were in the middle level role. A woman told me she was in the middle level role for a telecommunications company, and her boss noticed how good she was and how motivated and strong she was. Fast forward 5 or 6 years, she's running an entire division because he gave her these opportunities, yeah? And she worked super hard and was super successful. 3, project executive presence. Remember, we talked about credibility. Manage that two-way pivot that we talked about. 4 is very important, delivering a personal brand. Guarantee every single person in this room has something about them that is different, that is distinctive, that is special. It could be knowledge of another language, it could be knowledge of a certain kind of music or literature, but that is what makes you different and distinctive. Bring that distinctiveness to bear on your professional life. And that, you might discover connectivity with your sponsor, you might discover kind of a different way of solving a problem because of your knowledge of another domain. And finally, the 5th part is leading with a yes. Leading with a yes means being open to challenges, being open to new opportunities. So if someone tells you to go do something really difficult in an impossible location because it's important for the organization, your first reaction might be, oh my God, this is the last thing I want to do. But in reality, what sponsors are looking for are people who are going to say, you know what, I'm going to try that. I'm going to learn from it, and I'm going to do my very, very best. So that's, in simple words, the roadmap for positioning yourself. This is how you earn a sponsor. Yeah? This is how, as a protege, you map out your path and become sponsor ready. We worked with a lot of companies to find out how they were working to create this new type of global executive. And I'm not going to really go into much of the details, but I just wanted to give you a taste that large companies like Intel, Bloomberg, Ernst & Young, American Express, some of you might even be in the room here today, are doing a lot to try to understand how to unleash the full potential of their global talent. You know, at the end of the day, the purpose of this work is to inspire everyone to reach as high as they can and to flourish to their full potential. So I hope today's presentation on this roadmap for the global executive has given you each something to think about, that has provoked thoughts, created more questions maybe, and you found it of value. I think we now open up for Q&A. Thank you. So questions, I hope there are some difficult ones for me. Yeah?
Hello, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I just want to share, like, your sponsor, is it in Bangladeshi context, like, is it like Godfather or Mama, having a job to have a Mama? Is it like that?
It's an excellent question. I'll tell you, you're not the first person to ask me that. I've presented this data in other Asian countries, in Malaysia, for instance, and someone asked me the very same question, saying, is that your godfather? No, it's not your godfather, and the reason is this. Sponsorship is profoundly merit-based. It's not because they like you, or you're related to them, or you wear the same shoes. It's because you deserve it. So that's why the first criteria of being a strong protege, someone who can be sponsored, is to be a top performer and to do all of those 5 things that I showed you on the roadmap. That is work. That's working well to the best of your ability. So it's very much earned and merit-based. Historically, sponsorship may have been the Godfather syndrome. What we wanted to do is, make this dynamic, one that is actually accessible and systematized. Traditionally what happens, sponsorship has been around since the Stone Ages. Alexander the Great had, sponsored other generals that took over, yeah? Sponsorship has always existed, but typically sponsorship has followed what I call the mini-me dynamic. I choose to sponsor someone who I'm comfortable with, who's like me. What we wanted to do is to break that dynamic and make sure sponsorship is accessible to everybody, yeah? To people who are different from you, because if you keep selecting people who are like you, what happens? Groupthink. What happens is the global financial crisis in 2008. People joke that, if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Brothers and sisters, maybe it would have been a different result. There would have been less groupthink. What we want is diversity of thought, diversity of experience, of all kinds. So sponsorship is a critical way of creating leaders that are different and diverse and inclusive. Yeah? Thank you, though, for that question. The Godfather, no, not the Godfather, no.
There was a question on the left, yes.
Thank you, Ms. Ripa Rashid. In your total entire presentation, you have demonstrated us with the 2 concepts of one is vertical pivot and one is horizontal pivot. So my question is the relationship with these 2 pivots. Particularly, I believe that if someone is successful in maintaining some vertical pivot with the headquarters, that enables him in maintaining some good rapport and relationship with the teammates, which facilitates in horizontal pivot. And vice versa, if someone is capable of maintaining a very good role in the horizontal pivot, it enables him to maintain a very good achievement in the vertical pivot. So did you find any such relationship in your research, and what's your opinion about these 2 relationships? Thank you.
Yes, we did actually, and one data point, it's an excellent question. The question was, is there a linkage, is there a correlation between managing the horizontal and vertical pivot, correct? That's how I'm understanding the question. Absolutely. What I showed you was the individual impact of the horizontal and the vertical pivots. We actually have other data points that show that when you manage both together, the gains are even higher. And that makes sense, right? Because let's say you manage the vertical, think about your own experience. If you're managing that well, that empowers you, enables you, and gives you the confidence to manage horizontally better. And vice versa, if you're doing well in this domain, it really enables you to manage the vertical. So there's absolute gains, a double gain that happens from the 2. Great question. Yep. And there's going to be one at this end later.
Ripa?
Yes, sir.
Hanif from Etihad.
Hanif.
just wanted to find out that, social competencies basically varies from country to country.
Yeah.
So how does EQ or emotional intelligence, in principle gets embedded into the so-called the status quo within the corporate? That's question one. And question two is that now what I read and what knowledge I have is that EQ is not just corporate, it is now folding into individuals' personal lives, and it is really playing a very important role. So probably may shed some light on that too.
Thank you. That's a great, fascinating question. I'll start with the second question, because I think what you said about EQ being relevant all dimensions of your life is a hallmark of all of the work that I've been doing with my organization for the last 8 years. We never look at work and professions separately, compartmentalized. Everything impacts everything else. Society, family, culture, and work. All these things are interconnected, and the individual sits in the middle. So in terms of emotional intelligence, we're trying to redefine success in some ways as 360. What does it mean to be successful? To be successful, you need to be successful in all domains of your life, which means applying emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence among your kind of rank and file is a critical success factor. And, they may not be calling it that necessarily. People call it by different names, that someone's a very good people person, or someone really kind of is attuned to what the customer wants to do. Very good salespeople often have very high emotional intelligence, and it's only more recently that we've quantified it. Our point of view is that it's a critical component of the leadership toolkit and needs to be started really early on. I think what ends up happening, particularly in very technical careers, people just put their heads down and work. They focus on the tangibles, and you need to do that. But our point of view is that there's a whole lot of intangible stuff. And that's where all the credibility and the pivots and emotional intelligence that people need to, you may not master it immediately, but you need to be aware that these are the things, these are, in some ways, they're the strings in your bow that you can manage beyond who you are. So I hope that answered the first piece. Second question, tell me again, what specifically, by according to culture. Yeah, very interesting, you're right. And I think there's, this was one of the biggest studies of its kind, and I feel like we're just scraping the surface in terms of interpreting some of it. We have just as many questions. So I think that might be one of the still unanswered questions in our research. What we have heard a lot, because traditional cross-cultural global executive type studies really focus on that. That are some cultures are more introverted, some cultures are more extroverted, some cultures are more relationship oriented, some cultures are more individual oriented. So we really wanted to get, that ground has been covered in some ways. We wanted to build beyond that. But there is definitely a dimension of cultural difference that shows up in the differences you saw in how you project credibility, and the gender differences, the double standard that I showed you. So that's the best. I'll come back to you in 5 years when we've done more with the data. Okay? All right.
All right.
Thank you. Can I take one more question? Because it's from a friend.
Yes.
Sorry. And then we'll be done.
Thank you for that, for taking my question. I really am so proud that you've done this groundbreaking research. Really, congratulations to you.
Thank you.
It's great for us to be able to hear you in Bangladesh. My question is regarding the translating of some of these principles to the boardroom and within the context of family businesses, because I think that it might be interesting. I don't know if you've done some of that research, but I'd be interested to find out how it applies to not just the CEO, but really to the board, as well as within the context of businesses, family businesses. And then the other follow-up question is, the lessons you've said are very, I think, corporate contextual, but what I have seen perhaps is that maybe in context of, let's say, medical emergencies or in the operating room or when the Challenger disaster, I seem to recall reading some case studies where command and control, perhaps in that context, is really the only way to go to make sure crisis is averted. But if you could
Yeah.
please share something
Sure,
on that.
really, I love that you mentioned the other domains. One of my favorite sad examples of where command and control failed, where inclusive leadership would have worked, is not from Challenger, which is probably, I haven't studied that one, but it's probably similar. It's from a Korean Airlines disaster that happened a couple of years ago of a plane that almost crashed in San Francisco. I don't know if you remember that. They actually went back and studied how pilots operated in Korean Airlines, and they found that it was, Korea still has a very hierarchical culture, very traditional, and it was very much of a command and control culture. And apparently, a lot of the crew members knew something was wrong and hadn't dared to tell the pilot. And when they tried to tell the pilot didn't pay attention. There was the opposite of what I call an inclusive speak-up culture. The opposite was going on, and that resulted in fatalities and near fatalities. So that's a kind of extreme case. So absolutely, these precepts of inclusive culture and leadership, to me, go way beyond the professional workplace. My domain of study right now as an anthropologist is the white-collar professional world. So that's where our inferences are drawn from. But I think this idea of creating more humble, inclusive leadership prevails for no matter where you are, which kind of answers your questions around boards. Boards are a thorny realm, because boards still are the final kind of bastion of nepotism everywhere, not just here, everywhere in the world. I mean, every large company I've worked for and I've done presentations to board, half the board members should have retired 10 years ago. They're asleep. Because there aren't term limits half the time. They're the friends of the CEO. Boards, there's all kinds of issues. I mean, my God, you've given me a great idea. I should go take this mantra of inclusive leadership to boards. Family companies, again, we study mostly because we work with large private sector companies. Family-owned companies, I would suspect, suffer and limit their growth because if they don't have some of these things in place. Okay, well, thank you very much. Am I at time?
No. I mean, we have run over a bit, but thank you very much, Ms. Ripa Rashid. And may I request Dr. Farhat Anwar, Professor Dr. Farhat Anwar of the Institute of Business and Administration, to kindly come up and hand over a token of our appreciation.
Great. So, thank you, sir. I so appreciate it.
I think we could add another dimension to it. Not the differences, where are the similarities?
Thank you so much. Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Let's get some pictures. Oh, okay.
Sure.
We're not done yet.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Brand Forum. Thank you for having me. It's been a real honor to bring my work to the country of my birth. Thank you.